Welcome to So You Really Want to Learn Latin, and today we're going to continue playing around with participles, now that we've learnt how they work in Latin, and we're going to look at a few little tricks you can play with them, not least getting your spelling in English right. Now, before we do any of that, I just want to start with a little line from Virgil. Virgil, you will know, I'm sure, is probably the greatest Latin poet. He is to Latin literature what Shakespeare probably is to English literature. He wrote the Aeneid, great epic poem about Aeneas and his journey from the burning city of Troy all the way via Carthage, Dido and Aeneas and all of that stuff, to Italy to build a new Rome in Italy. Okay, the epic story of that, which of course is the precursor to the foundation of Rome, was written by the poet Virgil. And the great thing about the Latin we've been doing over these past months is that almost without noticing, we've got up to a level where actually you can start reading proper Latin literature without too much kind of interference from me or anyone else. Now, you know, it's a bit ambitious to say you'll be able to sit down with Virgil and read him, but I just want to give you one line, very, very famous line from Virgil, which just happens to use a present participle, and as we've just been learning about them, nice place to start. Okay, now, during the Trojan War, I don't know if you remember this bit, but the Greeks were camped on the plain outside the city of Troy, having terrible trouble getting into the city, and they had this wonderful trick of the wooden horse. This was Odysseus's brainy idea, and he came up with the idea that if they built a wooden horse, filled it with soldiers, left it on the beach, got into their ships and sailed away, then the Trojans would come out of their city and find this wooden horse. Okay. But that in itself wasn't going to do the trick unless they got the horse into the city. And so the plan was a bit more elaborate. They left behind a Greek soldier called Sinon, and he was briefed to be captured by the Trojans when they came out of the city. Okay? And sure enough, he leaps out from behind a bush and says, I've run away from the Greeks. They are terrible people, please look after me. And the Trojans grab this Greek and say, well, what are you doing, why are you here? And by the way, what's that horse? And this poor Greek traitor person, he's not a traitor at all, actually he's working for the Greeks, but he says, that horse, yeah, blimey, well, you know, the Greeks left it behind as a gift offering to the gods. And, you know, if the Greek horse is put inside the city of Troy, well then the city of Troy will never ever be captured. And the Trojans think, well, that sounds a good plan, why don't we get the horse back into the city of Troy? And most of them think this is a really, really good idea. But there is a priest called Laocoon who comes down to the beach where this activity is going on, and he says in Latin, well, he says in Virgil's account of this story, Time or Danaos et dona ferentes. Okay? Now, if you just look at that, you can cope with all of that. Danaos is, it's a proper noun. It is from Danai, which is a plural noun meaning the Greeks. Okay? So it's another noun that means the Greeks. So, tema o Danaos et dona ferentes. Okay, now the order is a little bit unusual for what you might expect because this is poetry, and Latin poetry, as we will be discovering later in this course, fits into particular patterns, and very often that requires the word order to be changed to fit the meter. But, you know, there's nothing too hard here. We've got the main verb, timeo, I fear. We've got the direct object, Danaos, the Greeks. I fear the Greeks. Et Now, we know that et means and, but et can also mean even. It's a very sort of emphatic word, or can be a very emphatic word. So here, time o Danaos, et, even, and then you've got dona ferentes. Now, dona is the accusative plural from donum, and it means a gift. Okay? And then you've got this participle, ferentes. Okay, so we can now cope with that. That is the present participle of ferro, which began like ferro and then went ferrentes, and ferrentes, ferrentis. Okay, so, and it is agreeing with the noun, and it is either nominative, vocative, or accusative plural. It can't be nominative plural because the subject is I. I fear the Greeks. So it must be accusative. It's agreeing with Danaos, and it means bearing or carrying. Pharaoh means I carry or I bear. So the whole thing, I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts. In other words, even when they are bearing gifts. Okay. So Laocoon, his advice was, do not touch that horse. It's a trick. Well, of course, you know, he lost out on that, partly because he found that his sons got snared by a sea serpent and dragged out to sea, and he too got dragged out to sea, and you know they thought, well, blimey, the gods don't like what he's saying, and the Trojans took the horse inside the city, and you all know what happened next. Okay, but I just thought I'd show you how at this exciting stage, as we enter the beginning chapters of Latin Book 3, we can now cope with Virgil, unadulterated, unedited, unsimplified, just raw Virgil. Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes. Okay, now, before we go on and do some more participles, which we'll do next time, I just want to show you how Latin present participles can actually help enormously with our spelling in English. Okay, it's a neat little trick. If you're wondering what on earth is the point of learning Latin, don't get me onto that subject, but one of the benefits is it helps with your spelling. And a really crafty area in which it can help with spelling is in those tricky little words that end in either ence or ance. Okay, so if you think of words like, I don't know, ambulance and convenience and repugnance and audience and credence, they all sound the same, don't they? They all go unce. But the really tricky bit is knowing, is it ance at the end or is it ence? And the same applies actually with words like repellent and repugnant. They all end unt, but is it ant or ent? Okay, well, there is a little trick that I'm going to teach you now. It isn't completely bomb-proof, and I'm afraid we do have our friends over the channel in France to blame for that, and I'll explain that in a moment. But if you just take an English word that ends unts or unt, if you can think of the Latin verb from which that word came, okay, then you're going to be 95% certain of getting the spelling of it right. So we'll start with ambulance. Okay, how do you spell ambulance? Well, ambulance comes from ambulo. Okay, ambulo means I walk, and the present participle of ambulo is ambulance with an A. Okay, so the English word ambulance is spelled ambulance with an A. Whereas if you think of the word convenience, now convenience comes from convenio, okay, I come together, venio veniri, okay, that means I come. The present participle of that is veniens with an E. So it is convenience with an E, not ants. The word repellent if we move on to these NT type words in English, repellent, is it repellent or repellent? Well, repello. Okay, I drive back. Pello, present participle, pellentes with an E. So it is repellent. Audience. Okay, I mean, you can probably spell it anyway, but just, you might not know why. It's not audience, it's audience, and that's because it comes from audio with its present participle of audience with an E. Then you get on to words that you probably don't use very often, like credence, believability, that sort of word. Credence with an E, from credo, I trust or I believe in Latin, present participle, credence. Okay, so credence is spelled with an E. Repugnant. Okay, it's repugnant to me. Well, that's repugno. Pugno, first conjugation verb, present participle, pugnans with an A. So it is repugnant, not repugnant. Okay. Now, I don't want to be rude about the French. I love them to bits. We all do. But the problem with English spelling is that our language is a kind of hodgepodge of Anglo-Saxon words, which are kind of spelled as if they're all in Welsh, and words that are derived largely from Norman French, which in turn had come from Latin. Okay, so we say English words are heavily derived from Latin, and they are, but very often it's because they've come to us via Norman French, and the Norman French has been heavily involved by the Latin. Okay, so just to give you an example of that, the word servant. Okay, now a servant is not somebody who saves you from servo, servare in Latin. It's someone who serves you. So that's from servio, serviere, which would have a present participle of servientes with an E. Okay? But our English word servant actually comes from the French servir.
Servir. Servir.
Servir, however you pronounce that. And that French verb has a present participle of ser. Ooh, blimey, I'm trying to speak in Latin and French. I don't know how to pronounce this.
Servant. Servant.
Servant. Servant. Okay. But it's spelled S-E-R-V-A-N-T. And our word servant is coming from that French participle. So, if my little rule about go to the Latin verb, get the conjugation of the verb, and if it's first conjugation, your English word will be spelt with an A, and if it's any of the other conjugations, it will be spelt with an E. That works beautifully, unless a bit of Norman French has kicked in and messed the whole thing up. Okay, and when that happens, I can only apologise. And of course, just sometimes, you get an English word which is spelt both ways. Sometimes with an A, sometimes with an E. A good example of that is the word ascendancy. You sometimes see that as ascendancy, and sometimes as ascendancy. And then we have the whole area of whether it's an English spelling or an American spelling. And that opens up a whole can of worms because, of course, we over in England have a habit of trashing the Americans for misspelling words. Well, actually, all they are normally doing is continuing to spell the word the way we in England used to spell it before we jumped on the Mayflower and sailed over to America with the Pilgrim Fathers. And they've just kept, in America, they've kept the old spelling, and it's the English who've changed their spelling and created a problem. So anyway, blimey, a lot going on there with spelling. But back to our main lesson here about participles. We know how they go now because we learnt last week. We also now know that It helps with our spelling if we understand the principle of the spelling of a Latin participle transferring its way into the English spelling of the word that comes from that Latin verb. And last but not least, we are now translating Virgil with our eyes shut. Well, actually not with our eyes shut, because you can't translate it if you haven't read it. Okay, enough about that. Next time we are going to be looking at future participles. But until then, keep up the good work. Do subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you back here very soon.